Welcome back to another episode of the Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's guest is Daniel Pink. Daniel is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including his latest, The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. His other books include the New York Times bestsellers When and A Whole New Mind, as well as the #1 New York Times bestsellers Drive and To Sell Is Human. Dan's books have won multiple awards, have been translated into 42 languages, and have sold millions of copies around the world. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Daniel Pink to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Daniel Pink, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this has been a long time coming. You know, you and I were talking before we recorded. I mean, I saw you speak at URSA 10 years ago or so, and it was a speech that, like I said, has still impacted me to this day. There's still some things in there that I use. And one of the things that stuck with me was you talked about like decision making, and you were essentially saying, like, for those of you who are having a hard time making a decision or moving forward in your life, like, what advice would you give to your best friend? And I know that kind of parallels what you're talking about now with your latest book, The Power of Regret. So, like, why is that advice like so powerful for people, and like why does it sound like so simple for people to do, like, once you tell them about that?
Well, I mean, I think the underlying reason is that human beings are pretty good problem solvers, but we stink at solving our own problems. And the reason we stink at solving our own problems is that we are too enmeshed in the details. We're too caught up in the particulars. We don't have a broad enough view. And so when we get into our own problems, when we think about our own problems, we're sort of like scuba divers. And what you really want to be for most kinds of problem solving is more like an oceanographer. And what that technique does is a part of some very, very interesting research in what's known as self-distancing, where essentially you try to take a step back. And one way to take a step back is this weird kind of identity shift where you say, what would you tell your best friend to do? If your best friend came to you with this problem, what would you tell him or her to do? And for me, I have people come to me, Dan, I don't know what to do. All right. And I say, what would you tell your best friend to do? And they say, well, I tell her, ba. And I'm like, hello. So there are other kinds of really good self-distancing techniques, and they can be useful in helping us respond to regret and also to avoid a future regret. But it's a powerful technique. For your listeners who are interested, there's a book called Chatter by Ethan Kross, who's a social psychologist at University of Michigan, that is very, very smart and good on better ways to talk to yourself.
Yeah, I know Ethan. He's actually been on the podcast, and he is great.
There you go. Great minds.
Yeah, his tips and tools and his research is so fascinating, and it's easily applicable. So I invite you to go back and listen to that episode and also read Ethan's book. And I know, like, one of the things that I've heard you talk about a lot, Dan, when it comes to regret is that we tend to regret like a lot of things we don't do. We don't take a chance on later in life. And I know, what is the biggest thing you're open to talking about that you have not done with your life that you wish you did?
Well, here's what the research tells us. Both existing academic research, there's 50 or 60 years of research on this emotion of regret in social science, in cognitive science, in social psychology, in developmental psychology, in neuroscience, and cognitive science. And I also did my own 2 big research projects of my own. And one very sturdy finding across those is that over time, people tend to regret what they didn't do much more than what they did. And there is, getting back to the old guy thing, there is an age effect here. And the age effect is very prominent. When we are young, say in our 20s or so, we tend to have equal numbers of regrets of action, what I did, and inaction, what I didn't do. But as we age, it's not even close. The inaction regrets take over. And I think there are a lot of intriguing reasons for that, because like certain kinds of action regrets, if I have bullied somebody, I can conceivably go back and apologize and make amends or something like that. But for inaction regrets, you can't really undo them. It's hard to find a silver lining in them, and therefore they linger, they fester, and so forth, particularly over age. It's a very, very strong age effect. Now, getting to me, in my biggest regrets tend to be, well, I have a weird one. And then one of my biggest regrets is a moral regret. Moral regrets are typically regrets of action. I hurt somebody, I cheated somebody, I swindled somebody. But my moral regret, and it's a big regret that I have, is a regret of kindness, but kindness through inaction, where I was in situations when I was much younger where People were not being treated fairly. They were being excluded. They were being left out. And I was there, and I saw it, and I knew it was wrong, and I didn't do anything. And that really, really bugs me. Now, I think the interesting question with regret is, what do you do with that regret? Okay. Now, one thing I could do with that regret is I can fall prey to the no regret fog machine that's out there and say, I don't have any regrets. You never look backward. No, don't look backward. Always be positive. Don't think, that's a bad idea. What I could also go is the other way. I could say, oh my God, I have this regrets of kindness. I'm a terrible person. I'm just the worst human being there is. I'm just awful. I don't even know why anybody would want to spend any time with me. I am worthless and useless. And this is a colossal mistake that's going to ruin my life and everybody's life. That's a bad idea too. What we should do is we should be not ignoring our regrets, not wallowing in our regrets, but thinking about our regrets, using them as data, using them as signals, using them as information. And the information that this particular regret conveys to me is, first, I value kindness more than I might have realized. The fact that this thing has bugged me for 30 years suggests that kindness is more of a value than I might have explicitly realized. The second thing is that it's instructing me on how to do better in the future. And what it suggests is that, hey, avoid that terrible feeling in the future. So when you're in a situation where people are being left out or excluded, do something about it. Stand up, bring them in, say something. And I've tried to do that.
I love it. I think that's great advice, because it's easy to harp on things you didn't do in life or things that you did in life that you didn't mean to do. But it's another thing if you can kind of have that growth mindset approach and say, I'm not proud of myself for what I did in that moment, but here's how I'm going to use that situation and use it to my advantage to not only make myself a better person, but also to help the people around me. And you brought up a really good point. You see a lot of people that's like hashtag no regrets. They assume they're going to live their life with no regrets. And we know that as humans, we're not perfect and that it's just not realistic. And I'm sure there's people that are listening to this right now that are thinking, as we're talking about this, about something they're regretting right now. It could have been something they did this past weekend. It could have been something that happened 2 years ago. For you and for somebody that comes up to you and say a coffee shop with this question, what's the blueprint to work their way out of that so that they can use that regret to help themselves improve who they are as a person?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there's a temporal aspect of this. And the temporal aspect of it is that if you did something this weekend that you regret, actually, I want to talk to you next week and see if you still regret it. And maybe even a month from now. There are a lot of things that fade pretty quickly. And so the regrets we should take seriously are the ones that linger, the ones that stick with us. And I just want to emphasize how important that is. If you think about it, okay, let's think this weekend. I didn't have, this past weekend, I don't know how many decisions I made this weekend. I don't remember most of them, let alone regret, you know what I mean? And so we make all these decisions and indecisions in our life, and most of them we don't remember even what we did. We don't remember even doing them. There are a few that we remember the decision, and there are very few that we regret over time. Those are the ones we should pay attention to. Those are the ones that are telling us something. So you regret something you did this weekend that doesn't involve a federal crime, talk to me next week. Or even next month. Now, if you do have one of these lingering regrets, and as you say, exactly right, perfectly said, we all have these regrets. Everybody has regrets. And again, I'm going to come back and actually answer your question directly in a moment, but let me go down one more little back alley here because it's important. When you say that everybody has regrets, that's extremely important for us to understand. Regret is one of the most common emotions that human beings have. There's a lot of research showing that it's possibly the most common negative emotion we have. It's one of the most common emotions of any that we have. The only people who don't experience regret are little kids, people with brain damage, and sociopaths. The rest of us experience regret. It is ubiquitous. And the reason it's ubiquitous is because if we treat it right, it helps us do better. Now, to your question, how do we treat it right so we can help us do better? And here, it's a few steps, but once you listen to them, and once one listens to them and once one puts them into practice, it's relatively straightforward. And the way I think of it now is this kind of process: inward, outward, forward. Okay? Inward, outward, forward. So the first step with your regret is how you frame the regret in yourself. So that's the inward. What we know, and again, we can go back to the work of Ethan Kross on self-talk. When we talk to ourselves, especially in the face of a screw-up, we're brutal. We talk to ourselves in such vicious ways. Don't do that. What a whole body of research tells us is that when you reframe inward, you should treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Don't treat yourself better than anybody else, but don't treat yourself worse than anybody else. So treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Recognize that your missteps and mistakes are part of the human condition. And also, and this is extremely important, recognize that it's sort of the attribution we make from individual actions. A lot of times when we do something that's negative, when we make a mistake, we think that that single incident fully defines who I am. And that's not true. So don't think of your regret as the full measure of your life. Think of it as a moment in your life, okay? So treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. That's inward. Outward. There is a very strong argument to make for disclosure. Disclosure is a form of unburdening. Disclosure of your missteps and things can be a way actually to build affinity with people more than we realize. But the other thing that I think is especially powerful here is that emotions, like regret, but any emotion, they're inherently abstract. Emotions are abstract. They're blobby. They're amorphous. That's what makes positive emotions feel good. But it's what makes negative emotions feel crappy. So when you write about your negative emotions or you talk about your negative emotions, you convert this blobby abstraction into concrete words. That makes them less menacing and helps you make sense of them. All right, so we got inward, outward, and then forward. And forward, we talked a little bit about, which is that what you have to do, you can't simply say, hey, I'm going to treat myself with kindness rather than contempt. I'm going to talk about it to transmute it from abstract to concrete, and then I'm done. No. What you have to do is you have to explicitly extract a lesson from it. And these are where those self-distancing techniques are really, really powerful. So treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Disclose, convert to language to make sense of it, and then extract a lesson from it that you can apply going forward.
Such great advice, and it's very tactical for people to be able to understand, because it's like they can just take this simple formula that you just talked about and then like apply it to pretty much any regret or mistake or whatever that they've made in their life and be able to move forward. Because you see a lot in the self-help space where it's just like, oh, the past is the past, don't worry about it, like just move on to the future. And I think that's almost like toxic positivity, and you become very Pollyanna because you're like, man, like you shouldn't have said that to that person, or maybe you should like try to heal the relationship with your mom or heal the relationship with that person, or try again. You shouldn't just continue to look at the past, it's in the past, and just forget about it and don't even learn from it. So I love how you talk about that.
What you're saying is extremely important. I mean, it really is, because I think that we have been sold in many ways a bill of goods, that we should never look backward, that we should always be positive. And that goes against what the science tells us. I mean, that is not always being positive and never looking backward is not a recipe for a life well lived. It isn't. A life well lived involves some looking backward and some negative emotions sprinkled in with the preponderance of positive emotions. But I think the big problem here, which you alluded to, is that no one ever teaches us very well how to deal with negative emotions. And I see this a lot of times with younger people, especially. I see people who are adolescents. So what happens is that they feel a negative emotion. It doesn't have to be regret. It can be uneasiness. It can be guilt. It can be shame. It can be fear. It can be nervousness, whatever, uncertainty, insecurity. And they feel that negative emotion. And they say, oh my God, a negative emotion. That's weird. I'm not supposed to feel that. And besides, everybody else around me is so positive and doing so well. There must be something wrong with me. I must be seriously flawed and debilitated. And that can lead people to spiral downward. Again, forgive me for repeating myself, but we have to hear negative emotions are signals. They're data. They're information. We have to listen to them, pay attention to them. Don't ignore them. Don't wallow in them. Listen to them, think about them, use them as a force for forward progress.
It's so true because we have been sold this bill of goods. It's like just be positive all the time. And even like when you're unhappy or you make a mistake, like it's okay, like it's happening for you and not to you. And like I think there is like some truth to adopting a growth mindset, an optimistic approach, but I think there also has to be room for accepting that this is part of life and you're going to experience these negative emotions that come with that.
Exactly. Let me just clarify here. We should have a lot of positive emotions. Positive emotions are an integral part to a good life. There's no question. We should have a lot of positive emotions. We should have more positive emotions than negative emotions. But we shouldn't have only positive emotions because negative emotions are adaptive. They serve a purpose. I mean, a way to think about this, I don't know, give me a negative emotion. Think about a negative emotion.
Fear.
Fear. Great. Okay. So let's take fear, negative emotion. So here we go. I'm going to offer you a deal. All right. So I have a pact with the world's greatest surgeon and God. And what we're going to do is we're going to offer you surgery where we can give you surgery. There'll be no lingering effects of it. The only thing we will do is we will excise fear from your brain. You will never experience fear the rest of your life. Do you want that?
No, I really don't.
Why?
Because I think fear in this weird way for me makes me a better person. Like I think if I'm scared of something, as long as it's not life threatening, it's a signal for me to work on that or to pursue that. Like
Okay. So this is so you're interpreting this at a much higher level of intellectual sophistication. Let me interpret it in my
okay,
level of intellectual sophistication. I'll tell you why I don't want that operation. Because if I'm in a burning building, I want to be scared shitless so I get out of there. And if I don't have the capacity to be scared shitless in a burning building, I'm going to die. That's okay. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
All right. Fear serves a purpose, and you give me any. Now, what you don't want, I just want to be clear here because there's nuance. You don't want to be scared of everything. You don't want to be gripped by fear all your life. You don't want to have fear as like your predominant emotion. That's awful. But you want some fear. All right? Just like you want some regret. Arguably, you might want a little envy. Because envy, arguably, not too much of it is completely toxic, but a little envy is a signal. It's saying, why do I envy that person? What is that person exhibiting that I lack? And is that an accurate assessment? And is it telling me that I can boost my performance? Or is it telling me that I have the wrong values? So again, more positive emotions than negative emotions, lots and lots of positive emotions, but you do not want to have only positive emotions. It is not a life well lived.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That my first instinct wasn't to use fear for safety and for survival.
Yeah,
like,
you were way too sophisticated in processing this. It's like think about anything. I think it's an interesting kind of thought experiment here of that. So think about an emotion like grief. I think about this. Grief is a terrible emotion. You want to eliminate it? I don't think so. Because why do we grieve? We grieve because we love. So it's an important part of the human experience. It's an important and enriching part of the human experience. Again, you don't want to have too much of it, okay? But you don't want to have none of it.
So how does our relationship with regret and our processing of regret change when it relates to things like time? Because like a lot of people who listen to my audience, maybe they're in recovery from addiction and they lost like 20 years of their lives. And one of the things I hear so often is like, man, like I regret not getting sober sooner. I regret not leaving that relationship sooner. And they look back and they've lost, 10, 15, 20 years of their lives. So do we hold on to regret longer because of situations like that? And if so, how do we process that differently if so?
It's an interesting question, and it depends on the kind of regret. So I think what you have to do is you have to be pretty brutally honest. So let's say that you've suffered from addiction and you ended up the years from the age, I'm making this up, 28 to 31 are just completely down the toilet. You didn't do anything. You might have had a lot of setbacks. You might have destroyed relationships, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now you cannot get those years back. Okay, that is the brutal, cold reality of that. However, if you think about what did you miss in those years, Think hard about that. That's going to tell you what you value. It's like, oh my God, I estranged myself from friends and family. Well, I think that what that tells you, and that bugs you, is that, okay, what you need to do is you need to reach out and you need to try to rebuild those connections. You're not going to be able to wave a magic wand and change the past, but you can rebuild starting today. This is one, I mean, I'm telling you this, you already know this, but I mean, if you look at like something even like 12 steps, a lot of it is very consistent with the science underneath regret. It's this kind of brutal reckoning with the reality, and it's actually going to the people you've hurt and acknowledging that and trying to repair that. Now, the other thing about that is that, there's an old, I mean, I hate to be woo-woo or cliche, but there is in this an adage that is useful, which is it's an ancient Chinese proverb that says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. Okay, I think we'd all agree with that. The second best time is today. So if you have those years that have been extinguished, you can't get them back. Don't wallow in that. Do something today to begin charting a better path, and use that regret about those lost years as the fuel for doing better in the future.
Yeah, you're right. And I love how you like kind of broke down like what that person was missing in those lives or in those years that they suffered from addiction, because that's typically how it goes, right? Like it's not just they use drugs for the 3 years. It's they damage relationships, they blew career opportunities, they maybe flunked out of school.
They lost money, they have themselves in a financial hole, their career has been stalled or set back. Yeah, that is not an egg that you can unscramble, but you can use that as a force for doing better in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk about like preventing regret in the future. I mean, because I used to say, I still kind of say this, I say like fear is temporary, but regret can be permanent, right? I think, I don't know how much truth there that is, or that's just me just trying to sound all sophisticated in the self-help space. But my theory is like, if you don't take a chance and ask that girl out, like later on in life, you're going to regret it. Cause that's like one of my big regrets now is like not asking certain people out, because I was scared. I wasn't confident. I didn't have the self-esteem that I thought that I was worthy of doing that. Now I look back and I'm like, man, like I blew my chance, right? I blew my opportunity. So that's something that I like to think about. I've heard you talk about like, I guess kind of like visualizing the future a little bit as far as regret. Like what is the most effective tool you think for preventing regret, in the sense where you're looking ahead to the future so that you can inspire yourself to actually take that chance and overcome that fear?
Let me respond to that in two ways. First, because there's another self-distancing technique that we can use on that I really like. But in order to understand it, let me give you the first part of this, which is that one of the ways that I myself studied regret is that I collected regrets. I've collected now over 21,000 regrets from people in 109 countries. It's called the World Regret Survey. It is probably the largest collection of human regret ever attempted or executed. So we have this database of, again, over 21,000 regrets. And one of the things that I noticed is in looking at the regrets is how universal they were, and that people seem to have the same 4 regrets over and over again. And 2 of them actually are directly on point to what you're saying. One category of regret that you see over and over again are what I call boldness regrets. Boldness regrets are if only I'd taken the chance. And so these are people who, I have hundreds of people who regret not asking people out on dates, hundreds around the world. I have lots of people who regret staying in a lackluster job rather than starting a business. People who regret not speaking up. People who regret not traveling, okay? You're at a juncture in your life, you can take the chance or not take the chance. And when you don't take the chance, not all the time, but a lot of the time, people regret it. Now, that itself is very revealing. There's another regret that I call a connection regret, which are if only I'd reached out, where you have a relationship that comes apart, usually in undramatic ways, sometimes in dramatic ways, but usually in undramatic ways. People want to reach out. They say, oh, it's going to be so awkward if I reach out, and the other side's not going to care, so they don't do anything. It drifts apart even further. Now, what those 2 very large categories of regret tell me is this, that in general in life, we should have a bias for action. Now, what does that mean? We should have a bias for doing stuff. My view, in talking to all these people who I interviewed and collecting these regrets and looking at the research, is that exactly as you say, that we are, Doug, slightly over-indexed on fear and risk. We overstate it. We don't think it through. So you ask somebody out on a date, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? They're going to say no. And where are you? You're exactly where you were when you began. The status quo and the worst case scenario are identical. When I interviewed people who didn't want to reach out to an old friend or a relative, they said, "Oh, it's going to be awkward." When the few who finally got around to doing it said, "Wow, that was way less awkward than I thought." Okay, so have a slight bias for action. A slight bias for action. Now, that's how we do it here in the moment. There's another technique that we can do to avoid future regrets. That's another form of self-distancing that we were talking about a moment ago. And it's one that I really like, which is if you're trying to make a decision, go talk to the you of 10 years from now. Imagine having a conversation with the you of 2032. Okay, so you just think about the person that you are who's 10 years older than you are right now. All right. Ask that person what you should do. That person, we know, because again, we have a database of 21,000 regrets. It's pretty clear what you 10 years from now, what I 10 years from now, what all the people listening 10 years from now are going to regret. They're going to regret not taking the chance. They're going to regret not reaching out. Okay. They're going to regret doing the wrong thing. So if you're unsure, talk to the you of 2032. Talk to him or her today, because if you don't ask that person out, if you don't take that chance today, in 10 years from now, the you of 2032 is going to be pissed, all right? If you don't reach out when you have a chance, and in many cases it's too late, the you of 2032 is going to be pissed. So don't upset the you of 2032. That person knows what you should do. So consult them.
So true, right? What do they say? They say like, be your own hero. Like, the person, it's an old quote. I don't know who said it. I don't know if it was Matthew McConaughey or somebody, but your hero should be like the person you're 5 years from now or something. I don't know, something like that, to that effect, where you have to essentially like self-distance yourself, like you said, from the present moment and look forward to the person that you want to become, and then help use that person you want to become to make like present moment decisions. So that way you eventually will get to that person that you want to become. It's kind of crazy how that works out.
Think about it as that's okay. But again, like I'm simpler than that. Like I think of it as, don't think about it as kind of like, who was it? Like Heidegger or whoever, the being and becoming split or anything like that. Forget about that nonsense. Just say, hey, I need some advice. I'm going to call the me of 2032. Hi, Dan of 2032. Should I take this chance? You better frickin' take that chance, because I don't want to be talking to you in 10 years whining about not taking the chance. So, I think that is another, again, to me, it's in the same general set of shelves of self-distancing techniques.
Yeah. One of the things that I found that was really interesting in your book, it blew me away, but it made so much sense, was you talked about placement with people like in sports, and how like the person who finished third often felt better than the person who finished second. Like, why was that?
Well, this is some research that began a long time ago with Tom Gilovich at Cornell that looked at Olympic medalists. And it's a very intriguing thing that they did. They showed participants who had no idea what they were studying video of Olympic participants getting their medals. But they shielded the actual medals they were getting and had them evaluate their facial expressions. Okay, so they showed photographs and videos of Olympic medalists. And they said, evaluate their facial expressions. Like, how happy are these people? And so you'd expect the gold medalist to be the happiest, silver medalist to be the second happiest, bronze medalist to be the third happiest. And that's not quite it. In general, the gold medalists were the happiest. They were pumped. They just won a gold medal. But in most cases, the bronze medalist looked happier than the silver medalist. Why is that? The bronze medalist finished behind the silver medalist. The silver medalist did demonstrably better than the bronze medalist, and yet that person looked less happy than the bronze medalist. Why? And the reason has to do with what's known as this incredible capacity of our incredible brains, counterfactual thinking. We can conjure a set of facts that run counter to reality. So the silver medalist said, if only I had pedaled a little bit harder, I'd be a gold medalist. They felt bad. The bronze medalist said, oh my God, at least I got a bronze rather than that schmo who finished fourth and doesn't get anything. So that's a downward counter comparison, what I like to call an at least. The silver medalist is doing an upward counterfactual, which I like to call an if only. And what the science tells us is that at least make us feel better, but if onlys make us feel worse, but they can help us do better. And regret is the ultimate if only. It's an upward counterfactual that makes us feel better, but can, done right, stir us to improvement, learning, and growth.
It's fascinating, but it makes so much sense because the person who's in third, they're probably already thinking like, well, there's no way I could have gotten first. It doesn't really matter. Like I was so much further behind. I was so far behind the second place, and the second place person was so much further behind like the first place. So like it doesn't matter. At least I at least got a medal, right? And then the second place, let's just say they were like a minute behind the person in the race. Like, dang, if I just trained a little bit harder, or if I just got off to a better start, I had a chance to win because there's so much unknown there, right? I think a lot of people's struggle with regret is their relationship with failure. And I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, and that we live in this society where we're taught that failure is bad, right? That if you fail, it means you're never going to be successful. It means you shouldn't try again. It means that, you're not good enough, like all these things. But we all know that anybody who's had any amount of success has failed in their life. And I know you talk about some practical ways for people to deal with failure. What are they, and how can people change their relationship with failure?
I think it's similar to regret. I mean, regret is a failure in some ways. And I think what you have to do is you don't ignore it. You don't wallow in it. You examine it. Again, let's get tactical here for a moment. One technique that I really like for harnessing failure is something called a failure resume. And it's an idea from Tina Seelig at Stanford University. And the idea here is, it's a great technique. I've used it myself. What you do is you get like a list, make out like a spreadsheet or something like that. In one column, list all of your mistakes, career, professional screw-ups, mistakes, setbacks, blunders, that kind of stuff. It's not fun. I've done it. It's not fun. But in the second column, then you look at each of those and you say, okay, what did I learn from that? What did I learn from that? Right? You write the lesson that you learned from it, and then you list, what am I going to do about it? And that is a way to be actually intentional and analytical about your failures, rather than being blithe and saying, oh, I don't care about them, or being self-contemptuous and saying, I'm the worst person in the world because I screwed up.
It's so well said, because I think a lot of times people, they'll either look at failure as something that's bad, like I said a minute ago, or they'll just look at it just in a literal sense and just be like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And then they don't understand like why they did it, or how they're going to move forward next time, or what's going to change, or whatever. And they end up just repeating the pattern because they don't develop the self-awareness around it. I know you interviewed all these people on regret, and there's just people I'm sure that are wondering, like, what do most people regret? You touched on the boldness and connection regrets. Like, what were the common themes, like, of what people regretted the most as they got later on in their life?
Well, okay, so it's a little bit different later in their life. The thing we know mostly about later in their life is inaction trumps action. But the four core regrets that people seem to have all over the world were these boldness regrets, if only I had taken the chance. Connection regrets, if only I had reached out. But there were two more. One was what I call foundation regrets. These are small decisions that people make, small actions or indecisions, inactions that happen early in life, no single one of which is horrible, but that accumulate over time into bad consequences. So a good example of this would be, I guess addiction is a little bit like that, or at least certain kinds of drug use is like that. The most common one, and I had people who regretted addiction in that, basically saying as a health choice, saying they're still negative, but they're not as devastating. People who say, oh, I didn't eat right or exercise enough, and now I am 41 years old and I'm woefully out of shape. The biggest thing, we have people who say, I wish I'd worked harder in school. I didn't work hard in school, and therefore I didn't learn much, and I didn't get off to a strong career. Then you have a lot of people who say, I regret spending too much and saving too little. I regret spending too much and saving too little. That was a big, big regret that people had. So that's foundation regret. That's if only I'd done the work. And then the other regret were moral regrets, which are if only I'd done the right thing. So again, with all of these regrets, you find yourself at a juncture. In this case, the juncture is do the right thing or do the wrong thing. And when people do the wrong thing, most of us, when we do the wrong thing, we regret it. And the most common specifics in that category were regrets about bullying other people, and also an astonishing number of regrets about marital infidelity.
Yeah, that's crazy. Do you think it's because with like a moral regret for yourself, where maybe you did something to yourself personally, or you didn't behave in a certain way, like with regards to your own integrity or whatever, that maybe somebody else didn't affect somebody else. But do you think it's more painful because you can't control whether you heal that relationship with the other person?
I think that's probably right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think that the shrapnel hit you and somebody else. It wasn't only self-inflicted. Other kinds of things, it's completely self-inflicted. So when you inflicted the harm on somebody else, it often feels worse.
Right, right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. The last question I have for you is going to be another personal question. And you talked about like the advice or getting the advice from like the Dan like 10 years from now is when it comes to making decisions now. Like, what is something that you're working on like right now that's a little scary, that you're a little uncertain about, but you're going to do it because you don't want to regret not doing it later?
I'm slowly, but pretty profoundly, changing my ways with regard to connection and connection regret. I am the classic person who said, oh man, I shouldn't reach out to that person because I haven't talked to him or her for 8 years. And it's going to be so awkward if I just reach out of the blue, and they're not going to care anyway. They're going to think it's weird and I don't do anything. And having talked to all these people, Doug, all over the world who had the exact same thought and in some cases blew it. I mean, I have people from the book who, felt that way, and then the person they wanted to reach out to passed away. And so the door completely shut on them. For me, my own view, and I would offer this up with humility, but I would offer it up as advice to other people as well, is that for me, though, if I find myself at a juncture where I'm saying, should I reach out or should I not reach out? Okay, I'm at the juncture. Should I reach out or should I not reach out? Being at that juncture has answered the question. Always reach out. And anytime I've reached out, I mean, I honestly, there has not been a time when I was at the now, okay, because in the past, before I did this research, I was Mr. Don't reach out because it's going to be awkward and weird. But now that once I did this research, I'm like, oh my God, I totally got this wrong. And now in the cases where I'm at this juncture, should I reach out or not reach out? And I reach out, it's never been weird. I'm always glad I did it.
And it's so true. And it's fascinating to hear you say that, because it's like, how many times do we hear that person who like questions whether or not they should go to this funeral of somebody that they haven't seen in maybe like 5 to 10 years. And they're like, man, should I go? Should I not go? And they're, of course, in the back of their mind, they're like, well, I'm never going to regret going, but I definitely might regret not going. And then they end up going. And then afterwards, like, man, I'm so glad I went. I had the best time, saw people I hadn't seen in forever, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, we hear that time and time again. So Dan, this was awesome. I'm so glad that we could kind of go deep on regret, because it is this misunderstood human emotion that I think can bring so many people down, but I think there's so much power in knowing that it can actually be one of your biggest assets if you choose to use it in that way.
Absolutely. Your adjective is spot on. It is a misunderstood emotion. And if we understand it, it can actually be a transformative emotion.
I encourage everybody to go pick up your book. I listened to it on Audible, but The Power of Regret, and really, learn a lot more about the emotion of regret and all the things that you share in there. And then people that are listening to this, you're going to get a lot out of it and be able to use that emotion to your advantage. And so, Dan, if people want to learn more about you, if they want to buy some of your other books, check out what you're doing and keeping up with you, where's the best place for them to do that?
I think the best place is probably my website, danpink.com, danpink.com. I mean, for those of you who use social media, there's links to the social media sites. I also have an email newsletter, and there's also just a large number of free resources and things on the website.
Perfect. Well, I'll make sure to include the links to that stuff in the show notes. And for those listening, I invite you to check out Dan's book, but I also invite you to share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Dan said about how to handle current regrets that you're holding on to. Maybe it was something that he said about some of the different types of regrets, or maybe it was something that he just shared about his own personal journey with regret as it relates to connection. Whatever it was, share the takeaway, tag Dan, tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and we'll see you next time.